Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. That said, I'm breaking the formula today and finally covering something not indie, if only because of the recent re-release of Ubisoft's comic-inspired brawler, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. While I dipped my toes into this title close to a decade ago, it's been long enough that I wound up wondering, was this trip down memory lane one I'd regret, or a pilgrimage worth taking? I'm your host Arlyeon. Let's find out together. Scott Pilgrim and Ramona Flowers are in love, but before they can skip off into the sunset, they must confront Ramona's 7 evil exes. Which, surprisingly enough, is a pretty good summary of things insofar as the game is concerned, since it by and large eschews the character building and drama which laid central to both the comic book and even the movie iterations of Scott Pilgrim, focusing instead on simply embracing the video gamey-esque violence of the world. That's not to say there isn't the framework of a plot. Each of the stages are replete with small scenes which serve to capture key moments of the comic. That said, if you don't have any familiarity with the source material, a fair amount of the references will likely be lost on you, leaving you to tromp your way through a series of hyperactive, absurdist scenarios. Really, the closest to a major narrative beat that occurs beyond those small scenes is the finale. Since to the game's credit, each of its 6 characters do have their own, albeit short, endings. Though I suppose I should probably tick that down to 5, because one of those endings doesn't really count. But here's the thing, while I certainly enjoyed the knowing winks that were laced throughout the game, those references which cue up fond memories of my time reading the comics, the meat of the experience was the fisticuffs, and the game doesn't skimp out on providing you ample excuses to throw hands with absolutely everyone, providing a stage-based brawler to tromp through. One that might look suspiciously familiar to fans of the genre, with twinges of nostalgia coaxed up as a random thug explodes into fake Canadian money, right before you dip into a sushi joint to get a quick bite to eat. That said, there are some quirks that might go overlooked if you're not looking for them. For one thing, your choice of character does matter here. Some of them have a bit more range on their attack animations, even if the relative range of options that they actually have is initially a light attack, a heavy attack, a block, and a crowd control move. Then their most fundamental option to provide them an early identity, namely their taunt, given that they can do things like a massive damage summon, an AoE stun, burst healing, or even provide the entire team with super speed. I'm looking at you, Ramona. There's also a group taunt that can even do bigger damage, though that requires several friends you can coordinate with for a group taunt. And here's the thing, as much as these all sound incredibly useful, you're not able to spam them recklessly since they do come at a cost. Notably, while you have to manage your health, you also have willpower to fuss over, which serves as a resource for taunts, your crowd control ability, and most importantly, your ability to come back to life when beaten down, which is a double whammy when you consider the fact that burning through all your willpower will actually have you using your health to fuel your taunt and crowd clear moves instead. If you're playing co-op, your partner can save you by death by walking with your body and mashing a button in the hopes of rousing you back before an enemy smacks them. But dying isn't even that big of an issue, because beyond the grace factor of having willpower, which can be replenished alongside health at in-stage stores, you have multiple lives to play with, and even then, even if all of those burn out, the only consequence to dying is getting kicked out of the current stage, with all of your earned money and all the stats you likely gain from buying healing items. Which, right, I'm just gonna go on a brief tangent here to actually get into character development, because while you level in this game, that has absolutely no bearing on your stats, which is solely derived from buying items from the aforementioned stores. Instead, leveling provides you a helpful full heal and, more importantly, unlocks an ability to further flesh out your arsenal, which in practice is a lot less exciting than it sounds, since every single character until their final level unlocks the same assortment of abilities, such as the ability to throw things really hard when running, the ability to parry on a well-timed block, the ability to roll, to grab an enemy, to stomp, tools which in practice feel very basic and almost like they should have been in your kit from the get-go. Admittedly, each character does get an interesting capstone ability, which provides options like a gap closer for Stefan or an anti-air option for Scott, but that's a considerable amount of time to invest in order to achieve that distinction. Moreover, while there's a second ability for every character, it's tucked away in a hidden shop, which means at the end of the day, you just have 3 key abilities to really flesh out a character's role in combat. And that's a bit of a shame, because Scott Pilgrim does provide a fairly solid array of stages to make your way through. Each of its 7 stages feels fairly different thematically and is chock full of their own distinctive baddies to bash, as well as set pieces to smash your way through, whether it's an impromptu snowball fight, escaping a murderous mech, or sidestepping a horde of rabid fans. And they culminate in some legitimately solid boss battles, especially if you ramp up the difficulty so they're beefy enough to withstand your furious fists. I legitimately think that going through the game the first time around is a treat, especially if you're a fan of Scott Pilgrim, but I'll be the first to admit that the relative range of offensive options at your disposal may wind up things feeling a bit like a slog if you're on your own. And here's the thing, while the game is co-op at its core, there's a very distinct issue with the game that hasn't even been addressed since its earlier Switch release. Specifically, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is broken, at least insofar as its netcode. I made several attempts to play with strangers and friends alike. I even bought some people the game, and it just would not work, disconnecting me arbitrarily, desynchronizing our sessions, and just overall messing things up to the point of being utterly unplayable. And I had marginally more luck with Steam Share, but even then I was somewhat held back due to the limitations there, such as it refusing to pick up my buddy's controller. And it wasn't just the netcode thing that was an issue either. While I have fond memories of this game, I also have very distinct ones of how things were during its initial release versus how it is now. And whilst I didn't have to deal with some of the lag I did in its initial release, I repeatedly came across a rather new set of issues, such as being unable to enter doors in order to access certain shops, or that secret area where that final tech ability is, or even to advance in stages. It wasn't uncommon for me to have to sit there for several minutes, hitting myself against a door until it finally deigned to let me inside, which was an acutely frustrating experience. Which is definitely a mood killer when you're a door away from a genuinely fun boss battle, but the lengthiest bit of conflict a stage has to offer you is them fumbling with how doorknobs work. Though, given that struggle, I'm suddenly less surprised that Scott didn't know that bread makes you fat.
Bread makes you fat?
Admittedly, these issues didn't really impact me much when I tried to engage with the side content, such as the zombie survival mode or the boss rush, but I wasn't here for the side content. They're fun little pastimes, but I kept hitting roadblocks with the act of actually playing the game. Anyways, that's most of my gripes about the mechanics, so I figure I just tackle the game with visual, because, well, this is the element that I can't fault the game for one bit. This is such a solidly stylish rendition of a comic book made into a game, and it was really neat seeing certain segments brought to life or interpreted. Even when it takes liberties and adds segments just for the sake of more violence, the areas it introduces are still a lot of fun, providing neat nods to the video game franchises that were referenced in the comics themselves, bringing the whole thing full circle. And that's without even mentioning all the small details of the characters' animations themselves, whether it be the way the boss die, to things like Kim Pine's taunt referencing a very obscure slice of the comic themselves. It very much feels like a love letter on this front. And then we reach the OST, and again, I have to give this game credit. It is in fact how I was introduced to the band Anamanaguchi, since their chiptune boss theme for Negascott has been living rent-free in my head for a decade now, nestled neatly alongside Taiko's theme from Precipice of Rainslick Darkness 4. It is a really fun soundtrack. It's so good. And that brings us now to the conclusion, and yes, this game provides a very nice looking, stylized, alternate look at the comics. I think it's a legitimately interesting exploration of the medium, and very fitting given the sort of brawler-esque theme that was held in the comics world. But I think it's legitimately troubling just how many problems I ran into. I was so excited to poke back into this with friends, only to stumble face first into that netcode issue, which was then compounded by the weird Steam share where he wound up disconnecting in a shop and I couldn't get him to reconnect, and I couldn't gain access to control his character like a normal couch co-op setting, which is a problem since you can't leave a shop unless both players do, and you can't save and exit a stage while in a shop, which meant I actually lost all that progress from playing with him. A considerable amount actually, since we've just been fussing around and cheesing the level advancement. Because, well, okay, I went into the weirdness of how leveling influences the fundamental moves you have access to, but what I glossed over was the fact that it's not based on defeating enemies, but rather on the number of hits you dole out, which can be exploited with Ramona because of the whole hasting the entire party thing. Not just because it lets you hit people faster, because when you combo someone while hasted, you'll initiate an extended auto combo, which can casually let you dish out some 50 odd hits per enemy who is stuck in your combo. So with some finagling, it's entirely possible to bunch up a group of 5 guys and just rake in experience and levels early on in order to gain access to some of those essential abilities. Oh, and speaking of quirks, here's 2 I glossed over. 1, gaining higher stats is not necessarily a purely beneficial thing. Higher speed on characters sounds nice on paper, but you actually get tremendously slidey the higher your speed is, to the point that it feels like moving on ice, and this can actually complicate some of the platforming segments you have to do later in the game, making them more of a pain in the ass than anything. What's more, hurling weapons becomes dangerous because they start to ricochet to an increasing degree and will just outright shave heaps of health off of you or your friends, and they might not be your friends after you do that a couple times. Secondly, while I mostly enjoy the characters in this game, like the Bass Band, Knives, and Negascott, given he plays like his boss variant, Wallace is such a half-assed addition. He is a mishmash of other people's movesets, and the reason I mentioned that there's basically only 5 endings, because his ending is the laziest. I really want to like this game. I grew up on the comics. I played this game when it first came out, and sometimes with friends, and I think you can even get a solid handful of hours going through that initial playthrough and just soaking in that experience. That said, I really do think that this game shines the best when it's co-op, and that's something which the game seems unable to do properly unless you know someone in real life. Compound that with the somewhat lackluster arsenal of abilities as the game progresses and the repetitiveness of the whole ordeal, especially if you're doing it on your own, and I ultimately have to rate this title as a fumble. There is a lot of love implemented in some elements. If you're a fan of Scott Pilgrim, I can definitely see you poking your nose into this. That said, if you're looking for a co-op brawler, I would be a lot quicker to refer you to something like, say, the River City Girls franchise, of which I will soon be tackling and reviewing the sequel. I can at the very least say, though, the first game I preferred to this. And if you're going to be relying on the built-in online play, it's actually bad enough that I would have to rate this game as an outright fail on the multiplayer front. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Also to my Twitch if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.